and sleepless nights followed, and as soon as I closed my eyes, I saw smoke and blood everywhere. Slowly, I recovered, but I've also changed. I'm more frightened and worried, and a lot older. So that kind of gives you an idea of that day. It happened a while ago, but it never ceases to amaze me that no matter how many times, hundreds upon hundreds of times, I read this part of my book to an audience, it's never just a piece of text. It's something that always remains just under the surface, very raw and emotional. Now, what saddens me even more today as an adult is to know that, as I speak to you right now, thousands upon thousands of children are dying, getting wounded in conflicts all around our world. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the inspirational part of my experience, the part that remains the beacon of hope, even in the darkest of times. The people that inspired me so much and helped me get through the war were my parents and my brother. And the first person I want to tell you about is my biggest hero, my mom. My mom had a job at the National Bank of Bosnia. She was determined to keep her job throughout the entire war. So Monday through Friday, she would wake up to, brush her hair, put makeup on, get all dressed up. And I would sit next to her as she was getting ready, horrified, because to me, it was as though my mom was performing some weird ritual before committing a suicide. See, my mom would walk 20 kilometers per day in order to get to her work and back, and every step of that way she could have gotten killed by a bombshell or a bullet. I didn't get it. Why was she doing this? She was barely getting paid. In fact, my mom's monthly salary, when she was lucky to get it, was equivalent to 1 toonie. So I just didn't understand why she was doing this. So I would cry every morning begging her to stay home, and she would say, "Nadja, if I stay, I'm going to feel dead. I'm going to be a prisoner inside our apartment, inside my mind and soul." So my mom would walk out the door, and every afternoon around 4 or 5 p.m., I would sit or kneel next to the front door and just pray that she would come home alive. Many of my mom's girlfriends never came home. They were killed on their way to or from work, and I knew that there was a real possibility that one day my mom wouldn't show. So every time that she did, I had the biggest smile on my face. I was just so amazed. It was a miracle that she survived. Now, I grew up to be a young woman during the war. I was 16 when it finally ended, and I was much older than my years because of the war. And I started realizing why my mom insisted on doing this. You see, the war deprived us of so much. All the basic human needs that we once took for granted: electricity, running water, freedom, education, and often people's jobs. And my mom felt that if she held on to her job, at least she was somewhat in control. Like she was still a human being living in proper society, proper conditions. So I always looked up to my mom for that. Now my dad, he lost his job at the beginning of the war. So many people did, simply because our economy collapsed. He was by no means jobless or bored, because he was in constant search of food, wood, water. We pretty much had running water in our apartment about 10 times in 3.5 years. That was a terrible deprivation. We simply couldn't survive without water. So my dad, he would wake up every other morning around 2 a.m. He'd gather any kind of bucket, bottle, canister, whatever he could find to fill with water. He'd get dressed in the dark, and then he'd go out into the streets in search of water source, like a fountain or a well. He'd find out that all other people did the same, so they created a very long line with their own buckets and canisters. So he'd wait there for hours, sometimes 6 or 7 hours, amidst explosions, whistling of bullets. And my dad saw people getting killed and wounded in those lines of people waiting for water. These were some of the favorite targets of the tanks surrounding Sarajevo. But he never once ran home with those buckets empty. He never once caved into his very human fear of getting hurt. He just stood there, risking his life for me, for our family. He'd fill up the buckets, drag them all the way back home, and then all of us led that water 14 flights of stairs. Now, my brother Sonny, he was 18 at the start of the war. He's 6 years older than me, and he just finished high school. He was an excellent student, looking forward to going to university. Then the the war broke out. And we all know what happens to 18-year-old boys when wars break out. My brother would have become a soldier. We needed young men to help defend the city, but there were these United Nations soldiers coming into Sarajevo. They were deployed to come in and help the situation. They didn't speak our native language, Bosnian. They spoke English, and they desperately needed people who spoke both. So Sonny, my brother, he knew English really well from school. So instead of becoming a soldier, he became an interpreter. He translated between the two languages as his job. Now, on his first day at the job, the UN soldiers asked my brother whether he'd prefer to get paid in food or money. And my brother chose food. Food was priceless. Money, worthless. All the stores, they were either completely destroyed and nothing to go to, or they were there, but the shelves were empty because of lack of economy and lack of trade and importing of goods. So money was worthless, but we all were desperate need of nourishing food. So my brother chose food, and I'll never forget this one afternoon. Several months into the war, it had been so long since I'd seen a single piece of fruit, just any kind of fruit. And my brother, he brought me an orange, just this beautiful, bright, big-looking orange. He handed it to me, and I couldn't eat it right away. I just held it in the palm of my hand for hours, just smiling and feeling so happy I had it. And then crying a bit and feeling so deprived and sad that I didn't have it. And it really hit me how hard it was to be a kid in a wartime. Now my brother, he was amazing. He'd cheer me up nearly every other day with a certain goodie, like a banana or a piece of chocolate or a juice box. And I was really fortunate to have a brother who would do that. But he didn't just stop there. He didn't just feed his sister and our parents. He pretty much fed our entire neighborhood. You see, every day at his job, he'd wait until those UN soldiers were done with their meals. And he'd go around their plates and get any kind of leftovers, like cheese or bread or meat. He'd put all this food in separate bags. And then as I would look outside around 6 or 7 p.m. to see my brother coming home from work, he was always surrounded by neighbors, and he was always passing out food to them. So I thought, oh, that's amazing. He's 18, he's still a teenager, but he's feeding a community of people. And I always looked up to my brother. I mean, he's my only big brother, but now even more so, I thought to myself, I want to do something. I want to be as brave as my mom, as my dad, as my brother, but what can a 12-year-old do? So one day, I was alone at home and I was listening to the national radio station. We really had only one radio station that broadcast through the entire country, and everyone was listening. We didn't have electricity, so you couldn't watch television, but if you had a couple of batteries, you could listen to the radio. And I was listening to a live radio show, and there were all these adults calling in and talking about politics and the war, and I thought to myself, I'm going to call them up. I took the phone, I dialed, and I said, hello, my name is Nadja. I am 12, and I would love to read some of my poetry on your radio program. Well, there was a bit of silence on the other end. They never had a kid called in before, so the announcer, she was quite surprised. She caught her breath and said, well, all right, Nadja, just wait a while, and then I'll even record you. And so she did, and that day she kept replaying my poem over and over again on the national radio. And when my brother and my parents came home, having heard it multiple times, they teased me. They laughed at my boldness for doing